Imagine a dragonfly the size of a hawk. Not a hawk-sized creature that vaguely resembles a dragonfly. An actual dragonfly. Wings spanning nearly 70 centimeters from tip to tip. A body as long as your forearm. Compound eyes the size of golf balls, processing the world in thousands of fractured images simultaneously. And it is hunting. It moves at over 50 kilometers per hour, weaving between trees the height of apartment buildings, trees that are not trees at all, because flowering plants do not exist yet. Nothing you would recognize exists yet. The sky above is a deeper, richer blue, thick with oxygen. The air itself is different, denser, more alive. And this creature, this Meganeuropsis permiana, is the largest flying insect that has ever lived on this planet. Full stop. Largest in 350 million years of insect evolution. Larger than anything flying today that does not have feathers or fur. It is not alone. On the forest floor beneath it, millipedes the length of a car, Arthroplura, move through rotting vegetation, their armored bodies wider than your shoulders. Scorpions the size of dogs patrol the undergrowth. Cockroaches half a meter long scuttle through the shadows. The air hums and clicks and buzzes with the sound of insects so large that you would hear each individual wing beat. This is not a science fiction film. This is Earth, 307 million years ago, the Carboniferous period. And for tens of millions of years, this was the dominant reality on the surface of our planet. Giant insects did not just exist. They ruled. They filled ecological niches that today belong to birds, to small mammals, to reptiles. They were the top of certain food chains. They were the architects of entire ecosystems. And then, gradually, they shrank. Today, the largest insect alive, the giant weta of New Zealand or the Goliath beetle of Central Africa, is impressive by modern standards. But placed next to Meganeuropsis, it is a toy. A miniature. A pale echo of what once flew through the ancient sky. The question is why? Why did the giants vanish? Why did insects, which survived every mass extinction, which outlasted the dinosaurs, which are still with us today in numbers that dwarf every other animal group on Earth, why did the giants among them disappear so completely, so permanently? And here is the part that should disturb you. It is not just that the giants are gone. It is that they cannot come back. The conditions that produced them no longer exist. The world that created Meganeuropsis was so fundamentally different from the world we live in today that even if every predator of large insects vanished overnight, even if every ecological pressure were removed, insects would still never reach those sizes again. The door is closed. The reason why tells us something profound about the relationship between life and atmosphere, between biology and geology, between the creatures that evolve and the planet that shapes them. It is a story written in amber, in coal seams, in fossilized wings pressed between layers of ancient stone. It is a story that took scientists over a century to fully understand, and in some ways we are still working it out. This is the mystery of the Carboniferous giants, and we are going to solve it. Before we can understand the creatures, we have to understand the world. And the world of the Carboniferous period was not a variation of our world. It was not a warmer version or a wetter version or a slightly different version. It was a fundamentally alien planet wearing the same address. The Carboniferous spans from roughly 359 million years ago to 299 million years ago. 60 million years. To put that in perspective, 60 million years ago, dinosaurs had just gone extinct. The entire age of mammals, Every elephant, every whale, every primate, every horse and wolf and human being. All of that has happened in less time than the Carboniferous lasted. It was an enormous stretch of geological time, and it was defined above everything else by two things: coal and oxygen. They are connected, and that connection is the key to everything. Let us start with the forests. In the early Carboniferous, something happened that had never happened before in the history of life on Earth. Plants conquered the land in earnest. Not mosses, not simple ground cover, but towering, woody, genuinely enormous plants. Club mosses the height of 10-story buildings, horsetails as tall as oak trees. Fern-like seed plants spreading across every available surface on every continent. The land was covered, for the first time in Earth's history, in something we might almost call forest. Except these were not forests as we understand them. There were no leaves falling and decomposing in autumn. There were no fungi breaking down wood efficiently. There was bark, and there were trunks, and there was an extraordinary amount of biological material being produced, but almost none of it was rotting. Here is why that matters. The organisms that decompose wood, the bacteria and fungi that today break down a fallen tree within years, had not yet fully evolved to process lignin. Lignin is the tough structural compound that makes wood hard. Today, white rot fungi digest it efficiently. In the early Carboniferous, nothing did. Not at scale, not fast enough. So the trees fell, and they did not rot. They accumulated, layer upon layer, century upon century, dead plant material piling up in vast tropical swamps that covered much of what would become Europe and North America. The carbon locked inside those plants, carbon that living plants had pulled from the atmosphere through photosynthesis, stayed locked. It did not return to the air as carbon dioxide. It compressed, over millions of years, into the coal seams that the Industrial Revolution would one day tear out of the ground and burn. The word Carboniferous literally means coal-bearing, and this process, this planetary-scale carbon burial, had a consequence that changed the chemistry of the entire atmosphere. When plants photosynthesize, they take in carbon dioxide and release oxygen. Normally, when those plants die and rot, the process reverses. Decomposers consume oxygen and release carbon dioxide back into the air. It is a cycle. The atmosphere stays roughly balanced. But in the Carboniferous, the cycle was broken. Carbon was going in, buried in swamps, locked in coal, and not coming back out, which meant the oxygen side of the equation kept accumulating. The oxygen content of Earth's atmosphere today sits at approximately 21%. During the peak of the Carboniferous and into the early Permian period that followed it, according to geochemical models published in studies including work by Robert Berner at Yale University, atmospheric oxygen may have climbed to somewhere between 26 and 35%. Some estimates push it even higher. Think about what that means. Every breath of air contained a third more oxygen than it does today. Every fire burned hotter and caught more easily. Every organism that breathed, every animal pulling air across its tissues, was bathed in oxygen at concentrations we have not seen since. And for insects, that was everything. Because insects do not breathe the way you breathe. You have lungs. You have a diaphragm that expands your chest, creating negative pressure, drawing air into a complex branching structure of airways that delivers oxygen to your blood, which then carries it to every cell in your body. It is an active, powerful, centralized system. Insects have none of that. They breathe through a system of tubes called tracheae.
Small openings on the surface of the body, called spiracles, lead into a network of ever-narrowing tubes that branch deeper and deeper into the insect's tissues. Oxygen diffuses passively through these tubes. It does not get pumped by a heart. It does not travel in blood. It simply moves down a concentration gradient from high concentration outside to low concentration in the tissues. This system is extraordinarily efficient at small scales. At large scales, it becomes a problem. The deeper into the body those tubes must carry oxygen, the more the concentration drops before it arrives. There is a physical limit to how large a tracheal system can effectively supply. At some point, the center of the body simply cannot receive enough oxygen through passive diffusion alone, no matter how many tubes you add. That limit defines the maximum size an insect can reach. But here is what the Carboniferous atmosphere changed. When oxygen concentration in the air increases, the diffusion gradient steepens. Oxygen moves faster and further through the tracheal tubes. The effective range of the system extends. The size limit, the ceiling that biology imposes on insect bodies, moves upward. Higher oxygen, larger insects. It is not a coincidence. It is physics. Research published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, including work by researchers at Midwestern universities such as Alexander Kaiser, has used CT scanning of modern insect tracheae to demonstrate exactly this relationship. As insects grow larger today, their tracheal systems consume a disproportionately large fraction of their body volume, eventually crowding out everything else. There is a hard wall, and in the Carboniferous, that wall was simply further away. But oxygen alone does not explain everything. Because oxygen explains why insects could grow large, it does not fully explain why they did. Evolution does not produce giants just because the ceiling is high. Something has to push the organism toward that ceiling. There has to be a reason to be large. And in the Carboniferous, there were several. The forests produced an almost unimaginable abundance of resources. Decaying plant material on a scale never seen before or since. Spores in quantities that would have darkened the air like smoke. And, crucially, almost no competition from above. No birds existed, no bats existed, no small mammals existed, no reptiles had yet mastered flight or aerial hunting. The sky above the Carboniferous forests was, for most of this period, essentially unclaimed territory. Any creature that could get into the air had an entire dimension of the planet to exploit, with almost nothing hunting it from above. For a flying insect, this was an open frontier. And evolution, given an open frontier and relaxed physical constraints, tends to do one thing. It explores the extremes. So Meganeuropsis spread its enormous wings into an oxygen-rich sky above forests that had never seen a bird, and found nothing to stop it. And for millions of years, nothing did. Let us meet them properly, not as museum exhibits, not as diagrams in a textbook, but as living animals, operating in a living world, doing what all animals do: hunting, feeding, competing, surviving. Because these creatures deserve more than a footnote. They were among the most extraordinary organisms this planet has ever produced, and most people have never heard their names. We begin in the air. Meganeuropsis permiana, the largest flying insect ever discovered. Its fossils were found in early Permian deposits in Elmo, Kansas, just at the edge of the window that still preserved some of the Carboniferous giants before the world changed completely. Its wingspan reached 69 centimeters in the largest known specimens.
nearly 3/4 of a meter from wingtip to wingtip. Its body length approached 43 centimeters. Hold out your arm. From your elbow to your fingertips is roughly the length of a Meganeuropsis body. Now imagine that body attached to wings wider than your shoulders, moving at the speed of a sprinting athlete, with compound eyes that could detect motion in almost every direction simultaneously. It belonged to an extinct order called Meganeuroptera, sometimes called griffin flies, though they are not true dragonflies in the modern sense. They were an older, separate lineage, one of the earliest successful aerial predators in the history of life. Their wing venation, the network of structural veins that stiffened the wing membrane, was different from modern dragonflies, more primitive in some ways, but clearly effective. They had been flying since the late Carboniferous, and they dominated the aerial hunting niche for tens of millions of years. What did they eat? The honest answer is that we infer rather than know directly. No Meganeuropsis has been fossilized mid-meal in a way that gives us certainty, but the structure of their mouthparts, powerful toothed mandibles, clearly built for gripping and crushing, and the size of their eyes suggest active aerial predators. Likely they took other large insects. Possibly they took small early vertebrates, small amphibians near water, anything they could catch and subdue. A study published in 2012 in the journal Lithea by researchers including Matthew Clapham of the University of California, Santa Cruz, analyzed the relationship between maximum insect size and atmospheric oxygen levels across geological time. The correlation was striking. Every time oxygen rose, maximum insect size followed. Every time oxygen fell, the giants shrank. Meganeuropsis did not appear by accident. It appeared because the atmosphere built it. But the sky was not the only place where the Carboniferous produced giants. Come down to the forest floor. Here, moving through the deep litter of unrotted vegetation, was Arthropleura. And if Meganeuropsis is the most famous of the Carboniferous giants, Arthropleura is perhaps the most visually staggering. It was a millipede, or more precisely, it belonged to the millipede lineage, an arthropleurid, a group that is now entirely extinct, and it was enormous. Current estimates, based on fossilized trackways and body segments found primarily in Scotland, northern England, and Nova Scotia, suggest that the largest individuals reached 2.5 meters in length. Some estimates push toward 2.6 meters. 2.5 meters. That is the length of a small car. Its body was composed of roughly 30 segments, each protected by overlapping armor plates, wider in the middle than at the ends, giving it a shape somewhat like an extremely elongated oval when viewed from above. Its width at the broadest point may have reached 50 centimeters, half a meter wide. Fossilized trackways of Arthropleura have been found in multiple locations. Some of the most complete were discovered in Northumberland, England, preserved in sandstone, showing 2 parallel rows of imprints, each the size of a human handprint. When researchers at the University of Cambridge examined a particularly large fossilized section of Arthropleura in 2021, published in the Journal of the Geological Society, they estimated the animal's mass at around 50 kilograms. 50 kilograms. The weight of a large dog. Moving on dozens of legs through the undergrowth of a Carboniferous forest. What did it eat? For a long time, paleontologists debated this. An animal of that size, some argued, must have been a predator. But the fossil evidence consistently pointed elsewhere. Fossilized gut contents in related species showed plant material, spores, decaying vegetation. The mouthparts were not designed for predation.
Arthropleura appears to have been a giant herbivore, or more precisely, a detritivore, feeding on the enormous quantities of decomposing plant matter that the Carboniferous forests produced. It lived in a world that was quite literally drowning in food, and it grew accordingly. The forests also produced giants among the arachnids. Pulmonoscorpius kirktonensis, sometimes called the Kirkton scorpion, after the site in Scotland where it was discovered, reached lengths of approximately 70 centimeters, nearly 3/4 of a meter of scorpion, with a fully functional venomous sting and powerful chelae. It lived in the early Carboniferous, around 340 million years ago, and it was not alone in its size class. Fossils from the Carboniferous consistently reveal a world scaled up. Cockroaches that reached lengths of 9 centimeters, large by any modern standard, were so common that the period is sometimes informally called the Age of Cockroaches. Mayflies with wingspans of 45 centimeters drifted through the humid air above the swamps. Insects that we would struggle to identify today, belonging to orders that no longer exist, moved through an ecosystem of staggering productivity. And here is something that is easy to miss when looking at lists of sizes and estimates. These animals lived in an ecosystem together. Meganeuropsis was not a curiosity floating in an empty sky. It was a predator in a food web. It hunted large prey because large prey existed. Arthropleura processed vegetation on a landscape scale. The giant scorpions hunted the smaller giants, and the early amphibians and proto-reptiles of the Carboniferous, themselves sometimes reaching impressive sizes, moved through a world where insects were not always the small things to be ignored. Sometimes the insect was the danger. The Carboniferous was not a world where one or two oddly large insects existed by chance. It was a world where the conditions for large insect bodies were so favorable that largeness became a repeated, consistent evolutionary strategy. The giants were not exceptions. In their time and place, in a real ecological sense, they were the norm. But the Carboniferous would not last. Nothing that dramatic ever does. And the end of the age of giants would come not from a single catastrophe, not from an asteroid or a supervolcano, but from something far more insidious. The world itself began to change. Slowly in geological terms, which means over millions of years, but with consequences so total that not one of the giants you have just met would survive them. The oxygen was going away, and everything that depended on it would follow. Nothing in geology happens overnight. That is both the comfort and the terror of deep time. The forces that reshape a planet are patient in ways that human minds were not built to comprehend. A change that unfolds over 5 million years is, by geological standards, relatively rapid. By any standard a living creature could experience, it is simply the way things have always been. The giants of the Carboniferous did not watch their world change. They did not sense the slow shift in the air. They hunted and fed and died and were replaced by their offspring, generation after generation, for millions of years, while beneath and around them, the planet quietly, inexorably, rewrote the rules. The first thing that changed was the land. By the late Carboniferous, the vast supercontinent that geologists call Pangaea was assembling itself. The tectonic plates that carried the ancient continents were grinding together in slow collision, pushing up mountain ranges, rearranging coastlines, rerouting ocean currents. The great tropical swamp forests that had covered the equatorial regions, the forests whose unrotted carbon had been driving the oxygen spike for tens of millions of years, began to fragment. The climate shifted. The deep, humid warmth that had sustained the coal forests began to give way to something cooler and drier in places. The vast wetlands started to break apart, not all at once and not everywhere, but progressively, in pulses that paleoclimatologists have identified in the rock record as the Carboniferous rainforest collapse. This event, recognized and studied in detail by researchers including Howard Falcon Lang at Royal Holloway University of London, occurred roughly 307 million years ago and represents one of the most significant ecological disruptions of the Paleozoic era. The forests did not vanish entirely, but they fragmented into isolated patches separated by drier terrain. The continuous carpet of carbon-bearing swamp vegetation that had driven the oxygen cycle for tens of millions of years was broken into islands, and with that fragmentation, the great carbon burial engine began to slow. Simultaneously, something else was happening underground, or rather, something was finally beginning to happen that had been failing to happen for 60 million years. The fungi were catching up. The white rot fungi, the organisms capable of breaking down lignin, of actually decomposing the tough woody tissue of the giant club mosses and tree ferns, were evolving. Slowly, across millions of years, the biological machinery for processing Carboniferous wood was developing. And as it developed, the great accumulation of unrotted material that had defined the period began at last to decay. Dead wood began to rot. Carbon that had been locked in the ground began returning to the atmosphere as carbon dioxide. The cycle that had been broken for 60 million years began to close, and the oxygen levels began to fall. Not instantly, not catastrophically, but measurably, trackably, in the geochemical record preserved in ancient rocks and in the stable isotope ratios that scientists like Robert Berner spent decades developing models to interpret. By the end of the Permian period, which followed the Carboniferous, atmospheric oxygen had dropped significantly from its peak. Estimates vary, but the trajectory is consistent across multiple independent lines of evidence. The extraordinary oxygen richness of the Carboniferous atmosphere was a temporary condition. A geological accident produced by a unique combination of biology and chemistry that have never existed before and would never fully repeat itself. As the oxygen fell, the ceiling for insect size came down with it. Think back to the tracheal system, those passive tubes through which insects breathe. When oxygen concentration in the air drops, the diffusion gradient weakens. Oxygen moves more slowly, travels less far through the narrowing tubes. The effective supply range of the tracheal system contracts. Larger bodies become physiologically untenable, not because predators are killing the giants, but because the giants can no longer supply their own tissues with enough oxygen to function. A Meganeuropsis trying to live in today's atmosphere would, according to physiological modeling, experience something like chronic oxygen deprivation in its innermost tissues. It would be, in a very real biological sense, too large to breathe properly. But oxygen levels alone do not tell the complete story. And this is where the Carboniferous mystery becomes genuinely complex. Because if you look at the data carefully, and researchers like Clapham and Garouste, analyzing insect size across geological time in their 2012 study in Lithia, did look at it carefully, you find something unexpected. The correlation between oxygen and insect size is real. It is consistent, but it is not perfect. There are moments in the fossil record where oxygen was relatively high, but insects did not reach Carboniferous sizes. And there are transitions where insect size shrank faster than oxygen levels alone would predict. Something else was also influencing the equation. Something that appeared in the sky. Around 312 million years ago, in the late Carboniferous, a group of small tetrapods, four-limbed vertebrates, were diversifying rapidly. Among them were the earliest reptiles, the amniotes,
creatures that could reproduce on land without returning to water. They were small at first, insignificant compared to the giant millipedes and aerial predators sharing their world. But they were learning, and critically, they were eating insects. For the first time in the history of flight, insects had real predators in the conventional sense. Vertebrate hunters with eyes, with speed, with jaws capable of catching a flying creature and consuming it. The ecological pressure on large, slow, metabolically expensive insect bodies was beginning to increase. Then, in the Triassic period, roughly 250 million years ago, something happened that would permanently alter the aerial environment. The first flying reptiles appeared, and eventually, in the late Triassic and Jurassic, the first birds. Now the sky had vertebrate predators. Fast, warm-blooded eventually, visually acute, capable of sustained aerial pursuit. Suddenly, being large in the air was not just metabolically costly, it was dangerous. A Meganeuropsis-sized insect would have been extraordinarily visible, relatively slow in terms of maneuverability at that scale, and energetically expensive to power. In a sky without predators, those costs were worth paying. In a sky with birds, they became a death sentence. Natural selection began pushing hard in the opposite direction. Smaller insects were harder to catch. Smaller insects required less oxygen per individual. Smaller insects reproduced faster, adapted faster, survived the tightening atmospheric conditions more easily. The evolutionary pressure that had once rewarded size now punished it. The giants did not die in a single catastrophe.
They shrank across generations. The upper end of the size distribution contracted slowly, the largest individuals leaving fewer offspring, the selection pressure grinding the ceiling downward millennium by millennium. What had taken tens of millions of years of permissive conditions to build was dismantled by a combination of atmospheric change and biological competition acting together. And then came the event that ended the Permian. 252 million years ago, the largest mass extinction in the history of complex life swept the planet. The Great Dying, as it is sometimes called, the end Permian extinction event, eliminated somewhere between 90 and 96% of all marine species and approximately 70% of terrestrial vertebrate species. Its causes were multiple and catastrophic. Massive volcanic eruptions in what is now Siberia, the Siberian traps, releasing carbon dioxide and sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere over hundreds of thousands of years, triggering rapid global warming, ocean acidification, and collapse of the ozone layer. The Carboniferous giants were already gone before this catastrophe arrived, but the extinction ensured they would not return. The world that emerged from the end Permian was ecologically emptied and then refilled. New lineages diversified into new niches. The reptiles that survived became the ancestors of dinosaurs. The insects that survived were, without exception, small. The new ecosystem, the Triassic world rebuilding itself from near total collapse, was assembled with vertebrate predators already present. There was no second open frontier. The sky was never again uncontested territory. Every subsequent phase of insect evolution took place in a world already occupied by competitors and predators far more dangerous than anything the Carboniferous giants had ever faced. The giants could not evolve back into existence even if the oxygen had returned. The ecological door was closed. And it has remained closed for 250 million years. Stop for a moment. Because everything described in the previous chapters, the oxygen levels, the forest collapse,
the sizes of creatures that no human being has ever seen alive. All of it comes from evidence. Physical, measurable, testable evidence. And the story of how scientists pieced that evidence together is, in its own way, as extraordinary as the story it reveals. Paleontology is detective work. It is the discipline of reconstructing a world from fragments, from impressions in stone, from chemical signatures in ancient rock, from the geometry of a fossilized wing. And the case of the Carboniferous giants is one of the most complex and fascinating investigations in the history of the science. Let us start with the fossils themselves. Insects do not fossilize easily. Their bodies are soft, their exoskeletons fragile, their tissues quick to decompose. The conditions required to preserve an insect in recognizable form are extremely specific. Rapid burial in fine-grained sediment, absence of oxygen in the burial environment to prevent decomposition, sufficient pressure and time to mineralize the remains without crushing them beyond recognition. For an insect the size of Meganeuropsis, the challenge is even greater. Larger bodies are harder to bury quickly. Larger wings are more likely to break or scatter before preservation occurs. The complete specimen of a giant Carboniferous insect is extraordinarily rare. Most of what we know comes from wings. Insect wings are the most commonly preserved part because they are flattened, relatively rigid, and can leave clear impressions in fine sediment even as the rest of the body decays. The venation pattern, the network of structural tubes that stiffens the wing membrane, is species-specific, as distinctive as a finger. From a single well-preserved wing, a trained paleoentomologist can determine not just the species, but often the approximate body size, the flight mechanics, and the ecological niche of the animal. The first Meganeuropsis specimens were discovered in the 1880s and 1890s in Commentry, France, a coal mining region where the excavation of Carboniferous deposits regularly exposed extraordinary fossils. The French paleontologist Charles Brongniart described the initial specimens, recognizing immediately that he was looking at something unprecedented. He named the group Meganeuridae and established the basic framework for understanding these giant insects that researchers have been refining ever since. Brongniart's work was remarkable for its time, but limited by the tools available to him. He was working from physical examination alone, with no way to analyze the chemistry of the fossils or model the biomechanics of the wings computationally. A century later, the tools had transformed entirely. CT scanning, computed tomography, allows researchers today to examine the interior of a fossilized insect without touching it, to trace the pathways of tracheal tubes through preserved tissue, to measure the density of different structures, to build complete three-dimensional digital models of specimens that are too fragile to physically manipulate. Work conducted at institutions including the European Synchrotron Radiation Facility in Grenoble, France, has used high-resolution synchrotron imaging to examine Carboniferous insect fossils at a level of detail that Brongniart could not have imagined. These studies have revealed internal anatomy, confirmed tracheal structures, and allowed biomechanical modeling of how giant insect wings actually functioned in flight. How did Meganeuropsis fly? Could it sustain flight, or was it limited to short bursts? Was it a fast pursuer or an ambush predator? The wing geometry suggests something between the two. Analysis of the venation pattern indicates a wing capable of generating significant lift, more efficient in some respects than modern dragonfly wings, though the exact flight dynamics remain a subject of active research. A computational fluid dynamics study published in 2008, examining the aerodynamic properties of Meganesoptera wings, suggested that at Carboniferous oxygen levels, the power requirements for sustained flight in large dragonflies would have been within physiological limits, but only barely so at the largest sizes. In other words, Meganeuropsis was right at the edge of what was aerodynamically possible. That edge was defined by the atmosphere. And the atmosphere is where some of the most ingenious scientific detective work comes in. How do we know what the oxygen level was 300 million years ago? No one was there to measure it. There are no air bubbles from the Carboniferous preserved in ice cores. Ice core records extend back less than 1 million years. The atmosphere of the Carboniferous is gone, replaced and recycled countless times since. What remains are proxies, chemical signatures embedded in ancient rocks and fossils that record, indirectly, the conditions under which they formed. One of the most powerful proxies is the ratio of carbon isotopes in organic material, the relative abundance of carbon-12 versus carbon-13 in fossilized plant matter, in coal, in ancient soils. Photosynthesis preferentially incorporates carbon-12. When plants are burying carbon rapidly, as they were in the Carboniferous, the isotopic signature of the remaining atmosphere shifts in measurable ways. By reading those shifts across the rock record, geochemists can reconstruct the trajectory of carbon dioxide and, by inference, oxygen levels across deep time.
Robert Berner at Yale University spent decades developing and refining geochemical models, most notably a model called GeoCarb, and its successors GeoCarb-Sulf and GeoCarb-Sul4, that integrate multiple lines of evidence to estimate atmospheric composition across the Phanerozoic eon, the last 540 million years of Earth history. His work, published across numerous papers including studies in the American Journal of Science, established the framework that most researchers still use when discussing Carboniferous oxygen levels. The models are not perfect. They carry significant uncertainties, and different research groups using different assumptions produce somewhat different numbers. The precise peak oxygen level during the late Carboniferous is genuinely debated, somewhere between 26 and 35%, with most current estimates clustering around 30%. But the direction and general magnitude of the signal are consistent across multiple independent methods. The oxygen spike was real, and it was enormous. Additional evidence comes from fossil charcoal, called fusane, found in Carboniferous deposits. Fire requires oxygen. The abundance and characteristics of fossil charcoal in a geological layer can provide a rough estimate of the minimum oxygen level at the time of deposition. Fires will not sustain below approximately 16% oxygen, and they become dramatically more frequent and intense as oxygen rises above 21%. Carboniferous coal deposits contain extraordinary amounts of fusane, fossilized fire compressed into rock. The ancient forests burned easily and often. That charcoal record is consistent with an atmosphere significantly richer in oxygen than our own. Then there is the insect body size record itself, which, used carefully, becomes its own proxy for atmospheric oxygen.
This is where the research of Matthew Clapham and Jared Carr, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2012, made a significant contribution. They compiled a database of maximum insect wing lengths across the entire fossil record, from the Carboniferous to the present, and plotted it against existing estimates of atmospheric oxygen through the same time period. The correlation was not just visible, it was quantifiable. Maximum insect body size tracked atmospheric oxygen levels across 300 million years with a statistical relationship strong enough to be used as an independent check on atmospheric models. The two signals, oxygen estimates from geochemistry and insect sizes from the fossil record, told the same story from completely different directions. That kind of independent convergence is as close to certainty as historical science gets. But Clapham and Carr also found something that complicated the clean oxygen story. When they looked at the period after the emergence of birds, roughly 150 million years ago, and continuing to the present, the relationship between oxygen and insect size broke down partially. Oxygen levels rose somewhat in the Cretaceous period, around 80 to 100 million years ago, not to Carboniferous heights, but meaningfully above modern levels. According to the oxygen hypothesis alone, insects should have gotten somewhat larger during this period. They did not. The upper end of the insect size distribution remained suppressed compared to what the oxygen levels would predict. And the timing of that suppression corresponded not to a drop in oxygen, but to the diversification and spread of birds. The conclusion was uncomfortable in its elegance. Oxygen set the ceiling, but birds pushed it down before oxygen did. The giants of the Carboniferous were not destroyed by a single force.
They were caught in a closing vice, atmospheric on one side, ecological on the other. And when the vice closed, it closed permanently. That is what the fossils tell us. That is what the chemistry tells us. That is what 3 decades of computational modeling, synchrotron imaging, isotope analysis, and fossil database compilation have converged to show. The world built the giants, and then the world unmade them, with the patience and indifference that only geological time can achieve. The Carboniferous ended, and life continued. That is perhaps the most important thing to understand about mass extinctions, about atmospheric collapses, about the slow grinding erasure of entire ecological worlds. Life does not stop. It reorganizes. It finds new configurations, new strategies, new shapes. The stage empties and then refills, always with different actors, always playing by subtly different rules. The world that followed the Carboniferous, the Permian, the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Cretaceous, was a world that had learned, in the blind and mechanical way that evolution learns, that small was safe. But let us not move too quickly, because the transition was not clean. It was not a line drawn in rock after which everything was different. It was a gradient, a slow pressure, a generational erosion of the conditions that had allowed the giants to exist. And in that gradient, there are stories worth telling. The early Permian, the period immediately following the Carboniferous, from roughly 299 million to 272 million years ago, still retained some of the atmospheric richness of the age that preceded it. Oxygen levels were falling but had not yet crashed. The coal forests were fragmented but not entirely gone. And in that twilight world, some of the giants still persisted. Meganeuropsis itself is a Permian creature, technically. Its fossils from Elmo, Kansas date to the early Permian. It was a survivor, or more precisely, a continuation of the Carboniferous giant lineage, living in a world that was no longer quite rich enough to build new giants of that size, but still oxygen-rich enough to sustain the ones that already existed. It was the last of its kind. And the Permian world around it was changing in ways that made its eventual disappearance inevitable. The reptiles were diversifying with extraordinary speed. The synapsids, the lineage that would eventually produce mammals, were expanding into new ecological roles, filling niches that had previously been occupied by amphibians and large invertebrates. The early ancestors of creatures we would eventually recognize were moving through a world that Meganeuropsis would have found increasingly hostile. Then the Great Dying arrived.
252 million years ago. And what followed was not a world hospitable to giant insects under any atmospheric condition. The Triassic period that emerged from the end Permian extinction was an ecologically gutted landscape, slowly repopulating from a fraction of the species that had existed before. The insects that survived, and insects as a group survived remarkably well compared to marine invertebrates, losing perhaps 35% of their families compared to the catastrophic losses in the ocean, were small, adaptable, generalist species. The kind of insects that could eat almost anything, live almost anywhere, reproduce fast enough to replace their losses before the next environmental shock arrived. Those survivors became the ancestors of every insect alive today. Every beetle, every fly, every moth, every ant, every bee. Every one of the approximately 10 million insect species estimated to currently exist on Earth descends from the survivors of that Permian collapse. And none of those survivors were giants. The new world they built was a world of smallness and abundance, and it worked extraordinarily well. Consider the numbers.
Insects today represent more than half of all known animal species on Earth. Their total biomass, the combined weight of all insects alive at any given moment, dwarfs that of all other animals combined, including humans. A single colony of leafcutter ants can contain 8 million individuals. A locust swarm can cover 150 square kilometers and contain 40 to 80 million insects per square kilometer. The Amazon rainforest contains an estimated 100 billion individual insects per square kilometer of forest floor. Smallness in the post-Carboniferous world was not a retreat. It was a triumph. But triumph at small scales meant abandoning something extraordinary. And the ecological roles that the Carboniferous giants once filled, the large aerial predators, the massive detritivores, the giant arthropod hunters of the undergrowth, those roles were not left empty. They were filled by vertebrates. The birds that appeared in the late Jurassic and diversified explosively after the end Cretaceous extinction took the aerial predator role that Meganeuropsis had once occupied. The large ground-dwelling beetles and millipedes that remained, impressive by modern standards, tiny by Carboniferous ones, ceded the megadetritivore niche to earthworms, to fungi, to small mammals. The hunting roles once shared between giant scorpions and early reptiles became purely vertebrate territory. The handover was so complete and happened so gradually over such enormous spans of time that today we do not even perceive it as a handover. We look at a hawk hunting and see a bird. We do not see the ghost of a griffinfly that once held the same position in the food web 300 million years ago. But the ghost is there, and the modern insects that exist in the hawk's world are not failures. They are not diminished versions of their Carboniferous ancestors. They are exquisitely specialized, breathtakingly diverse, evolutionarily inventive in ways that dwarf anything the Carboniferous giants achieved. The diversity of beetle species alone, with estimates ranging from 300,000 to 400,000 described species and perhaps millions more undescribed, represents an evolutionary creativity that no Carboniferous ecosystem could match. What the modern insect world lost in scale, it gained in variety. There is one more piece of this story that deserves attention, one more thread in the tapestry of what the post-Carboniferous world became: the plants. Remember that the Carboniferous giant insects existed in a world without flowering plants, without fruit, without nectar, without the extraordinary co-evolutionary partnership between insects and angiosperms that would eventually transform both the insects and the plants into the dominant terrestrial life forms on Earth.
Flowering plants, angiosperms, appeared in the Cretaceous period, roughly 130 million years ago, and their appearance set off one of the most explosive co-evolutionary events in the history of life. Plants evolved flowers to attract insects. Insects evolved to exploit flowers. Each drove the evolution of the other in an accelerating feedback loop of specialization and diversification. Bees evolved, butterflies evolved, moths with tongues precisely calibrated to the depth of specific flowers evolved. Beetles that specialized in particular plant families evolved. The relationship between insects and flowering plants produced more new species in a shorter geological time than almost any other evolutionary interaction in Earth's history. The Carboniferous giants had none of this. They lived in a world of spores and ferns and club mosses, a world productive and vast, but ecologically simpler in fundamental ways. They were powerful. They were enormous.
But they were not, in the end, as evolutionarily fertile as the small, fast, adaptable insects that replaced them. The giants dominated for tens of millions of years. Their successors have dominated for 250 million years, and counting. Perhaps that is the deepest lesson of the Carboniferous. Bigger is not always better. Sometimes the most powerful evolutionary strategy is not size and dominance, but flexibility and smallness, and the ability to fit into every crack in the world, to eat almost anything, to survive almost everything, to be overlooked by predators and catastrophes alike, and emerge, slightly altered, on the other side. The giants of the Carboniferous were an answer to a specific question that the planet was asking at a specific moment in its history. When the planet stopped asking that question, the giants ceased to exist. The insects that survived were the ones with answers that worked for every question. And they are still answering, today, in their billions upon billions, in every habitat on Earth, from the deepest soil to the highest alpine meadow, from the driest desert to the wettest rainforest. Smaller than a hawk, but here, still here. Here is the question that the title of this video promised to answer, and it deserves a direct, unflinching response. Not a poetic one, not a vague one, a precise, scientifically grounded answer to one of the most fascinating hypothetical questions in all of natural history. Could giant insects ever return? No. And the reasons why tell us something profound about the nature of evolution, about the relationship between life and the planet it inhabits, and about the particular unrepeatable moment in Earth's history that produced the Carboniferous giants in the first place. Let us take the reasons one by one. The first reason is atmospheric, and it is the most straightforward. To produce insects the size of Meganeuropsis, you need oxygen levels significantly above what the modern atmosphere provides.
Current atmospheric oxygen sits at 21%. The models suggest you need somewhere in the range of 26 to 35% to push insect size into Carboniferous territory. That is not a small difference. That is a fundamentally different atmosphere, one that would make wildfires dramatically more frequent and intense, one that would alter the respiratory physiology of every air-breathing organism on the planet. Could the atmosphere ever return to those oxygen levels? In theory, the mechanism exists. If carbon burial accelerated dramatically, if vast quantities of organic material began accumulating without decomposing, as they did in the Carboniferous, oxygen could begin to rise again. But the specific conditions that drove Carboniferous carbon burial were unique. The evolution of lignin outpacing the evolution of lignin-digesting fungi
was a one-time event. It cannot happen again because the fungi already exist. The biological machinery for decomposing wood is now fully developed and globally distributed. Dead wood rots. Carbon returns to the atmosphere. The loop that was broken for 60 million years during the Carboniferous is now closed, and closing it again would require dismantling hundreds of millions of years of fungal evolution. The Carboniferous oxygen spike was not just an atmospheric event. It was a biological accident that depended on a specific gap in the tree of life, a gap that has since been filled. But let us suppose, hypothetically, that something did drive oxygen levels upward, a scenario so unlikely it exists only as a thought experiment. Would giant insects re-evolve? This is where the second reason comes in. And the second reason is ecological, and it is, in some ways, even more absolute than the atmospheric one. The sky is occupied. When Meganeuropsis spread its wings over the Carboniferous forests, it was entering an aerial environment with essentially no vertebrate competition. No birds, no bats, no pterosaurs.
No flying reptiles of any kind. The only aerial predators were other large insects. The only pressure against size in the air was metabolic cost and the physics of the tracheal system. Today, the aerial environment is one of the most contested ecological spaces on the planet. There are approximately 10,000 species of birds, roughly 1,400 species of bats. Every one of them is a highly efficient, warm-blooded, visually acute predator capable of pursuing, catching, and consuming flying prey. A large insect in today's sky is not an apex predator exploring an open frontier. It is a target. The evolutionary pressure against large body size in flying insects today is not theoretical. It is immediate, constant, and lethal. Study after study of predation pressure on insects, including research examining the correlation between bird diversity and insect body size across different geographical regions, consistently shows that higher vertebrate predator diversity correlates with smaller average insect body size. The pressure is real and it is measurable. For a lineage of insects to evolve back toward Carboniferous sizes, it would need to do so under constant, intense predation pressure from the most sophisticated aerial hunters in the history of life on Earth. The selective advantage of large size would need to overcome not just the metabolic cost and the tracheal limitation, already challenging at modern oxygen levels, but also the dramatically increased predation risk that comes with being large, slow-turning, and visible in a sky full of birds and bats. The math does not work. Evolution is not teleological. It does not plan toward a goal. It simply rewards what survives and reproduces. And in the modern sky, large insects do not survive and reproduce better than small ones. They survive and reproduce worse. The third reason is developmental, and it is perhaps the most Insect body size is not just limited by oxygen availability and predation pressure. It is also constrained by the developmental system itself, the genetic and physiological machinery that controls how insects grow. Modern insects grow through a process called molting. As the insect grows, it periodically sheds its exoskeleton and produces a larger one. The timing and number of molts and the hormonal signals that control them determine the final body size of the adult. This system is ancient, conserved, and deeply embedded in insect biology. Research into the developmental biology of insect size, including work examining the role of oxygen-sensing pathways in controlling growth, published in journals including Current Biology, has shown that modern insect lineages have developmental systems calibrated to current atmospheric conditions.
The oxygen-sensing mechanisms that regulate tracheal growth, that signal when tissues are receiving adequate oxygen, that trigger the hormonal cascades controlling body size, all of these are tuned to an atmosphere of 21% oxygen. Evolving toward significantly larger body sizes would require not just growing bigger, but rewiring the developmental control system to support larger bodies under current oxygen conditions. That would mean simultaneously evolving larger spiracles, more extensively branching trachea, more efficient oxygen delivery at greater tissue depths, and doing so against the background of predation pressure that punishes large size at every intermediate step. There is no incremental path to Carboniferous scale insect bodies that does not pass through a long series of intermediate sizes that are, under modern conditions, less fit than the smaller sizes they replace. Evolution has no foresight. It cannot sacrifice fitness today for a hypothetical advantage at a much larger size that might be reached millions of years from now.
Every intermediate step must itself be an improvement, or selection eliminates it. The path back to giant insect bodies is blocked not just at the destination, but at every point along the route. The fourth reason is competitive, and it closes the final door. The ecological roles once occupied by Carboniferous giant insects are not vacant. They were vacated 250 million years ago and immediately filled by other lineages that have had 250 million years to specialize, diversify, and optimize for those roles. Large aerial predators in the modern world are birds and bats. They are extraordinarily good at what they do. They are warm-blooded, giving them consistent performance regardless of ambient temperature. They have complex brains, sophisticated sensory systems, and behavioral flexibility that no insect can match. They have been refining their aerial hunting strategies for 150 million years in the case of birds, 65 million years in the case of bats. An insect lineage evolving toward large size would not be filling a vacant niche. It would be attempting to displace an entrenched, highly optimized occupant from a position of energetic and physiological disadvantage. That does not happen, not in the time frames and under the selective pressures that evolution operates through. The large detritivore niche, once partially occupied by Arthropleura, is now filled by earthworms, by termites, by a vast community of soil organisms that collectively process dead plant material with an efficiency that dwarfs anything a giant millipede could achieve. The ecosystem services provided by Arthropleura are now delivered by thousands of species working at small scales with vastly greater collective throughput. There is no vacancy. There is no open frontier. Every ecological role that a hypothetical giant insect might occupy is already held by highly specialized, deeply entrenched occupants under conditions that favor those occupants in every physiological dimension. Let us be honest about what all of this means. The Carboniferous giants were not a stage that life passed through on its way to something better. They were not a prototype that evolution improved upon. They were a specific, contingent, unrepeatable response to a specific, contingent, unrepeatable set of conditions. They existed because a gap opened in the atmosphere, in the ecosystem, in the biological machinery for decomposing wood, and they filled that gap with extraordinary effectiveness. When the gap closed, they disappeared. They cannot return because the gap cannot reopen. The atmosphere is different. The ecosystem is occupied. The developmental pathways are calibrated to a different world. The selective pressures run in the opposite direction. When we look at a modern dragonfly, a magnificent insect in its own right, a supreme aerial predator at its own scale, a creature whose design has been refined over 300 million years, we are not looking at a diminished giant.
We are looking at an organism perfectly adapted to the world that exists. Meganeuropsis was perfectly adapted to a world that no longer exists. That is not tragedy. That is evolution. But it is also a reminder of something that the deep history of life teaches repeatedly, in story after story, extinction after extinction, across billions of years of Earth's biological record. The conditions that produce any given form of life are never permanent. The world that built you is always, eventually, becoming something else. 307 million years ago, a dragonfly lifted from the surface of a swamp. The water below it was dark and still, covered in a thin film of spores from the towering club mosses that lined the bank. The air was thick, oxygen-rich, humming with the sound of 1,000 other insects moving through the undergrowth. Somewhere behind it, in the shadows between the great trunks, Arthropleura moved its armored body through the deep litter, unhurried, enormous, ancient even then. The dragonfly rose above the canopy. Below it, a world that no human eye would ever see stretched to every horizon. Forests of impossible trees, swamps that would become the coal seams of industrial England, of Pennsylvania, of the Donbass. An atmosphere that burned hotter and breathed deeper than anything alive today could comfortably survive. It hung in the air for a moment, and then it was gone. Not that individual animal. Every individual animal that has ever lived is gone. But the lineage, the possibility, the world that made it necessary and made it possible, all of it eventually gone. What remains? The coal, first of all. Every time a coal-fired power plant burns, it is consuming the compressed remains of Carboniferous forests. The carbon that those ancient club mosses pulled from the atmosphere 300 million years ago. The carbon that was never returned because nothing could rot the wood fast enough. The carbon that drove the oxygen spike that built the giants. That carbon is still here, locked in seams of black rock beneath our feet, or released into the atmosphere when we burn it. In a strange and literal sense, the Carboniferous giant insects owe their existence to the same buried carbon that powered the Industrial Revolution. The coal and the dragonfly are part of the same story. Two consequences of the same broken decomposition cycle, separated by 300 million years. The amber comes next. Amber, fossilized tree resin, has preserved insects in extraordinary detail from various periods of Earth's history.
The most famous amber deposits, from the Cretaceous period of what is now Myanmar, the Baltic region, and the Dominican Republic, contain insects preserved so perfectly that individual hairs on their legs are visible, that the contents of their digestive tracts can sometimes be analyzed, that the structural coloration of their wings, the microscopic architecture that produced iridescent color, can still be studied. These amber insects are not Carboniferous giants. They are small Cretaceous creatures, the descendants of the survivors. But they connect us to the deep insect past with a directness that no other fossil medium achieves. Looking at an insect in amber is looking at an organism that was alive, that moved, that breathed, that hunted or fed or mated, and then was caught and preserved and handed across tens of millions of years to a pair of human eyes in the present. The fossils of the Carboniferous giants are less intimate. They are mostly wings, impressions in shale and limestone, two-dimensional ghosts of three-dimensional animals preserved in the coal measures of England and France and North America. They require more interpretation, more reconstruction, more of the detective work that paleontology demands. But they are there.
In the collections of the Natural History Museum in London, the Muséum National d'Histoire Naturelle in Paris, the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, wings that span nearly 3/4 of a meter, pressed between layers of ancient stone, waiting for the next generation of researchers with better tools and sharper questions. And the questions are still coming, because for all that has been established about the Carboniferous giants, the field is far from finished. There are genuine, active, unresolved debates that researchers are working through right now. The oxygen hypothesis, for all its elegance and evidential support, is still not universally accepted as a complete explanation. Some researchers argue that the correlation between oxygen and insect size, while real, may be confounded by other variables: temperature, humidity, the structure of the vegetation available as habitat, that also changed across the same time periods and may have contributed to shifts in maximum insect size independently of oxygen. Others have pointed to evidence that some modern insects, when raised in experimentally elevated oxygen environments in laboratory conditions, do not simply grow larger, they grow differently, with altered tracheal architecture and sometimes reduced fitness at intermediate sizes. The relationship between oxygen and insect size may be more complex, more non-linear than the clean correlation in the fossil record suggests. Research published in 2010 in the journal Evolution by researchers including Wilco Verburg and David Bilton examined the physiological mechanisms linking oxygen to body size in aquatic insects, finding that the relationship was real but mediated by specific developmental constraints that varied between lineages. Not all insects respond to elevated oxygen in the same way. The Carboniferous giants may have belonged to lineages with particular developmental sensitivity to oxygen that no longer have close living relatives, which raises a question that paleontologists return to repeatedly. Were the Carboniferous giants physiologically exceptional? Did they possess specific biological features that allowed them to exploit the high oxygen atmosphere in ways that other insect lineages could not? Or were they simply the largest members of a general trend toward larger size that affected all insects of the period, with the giants being the visible extreme of a distribution that was shifted upward across the board? The fossil record cannot yet answer this definitively. Complete body fossils of Carboniferous insects, beyond wing impressions, are rare enough that the physiological details of the giants remain partly inferential. There is also the question of behavior. We know the sizes. We know the rough ecological roles. We know something about flight mechanics and diet from mouthpart morphology and wing geometry. But the behavior of Meganeuropsis, how it hunted, whether it was territorial, whether it was solitary or aggregated near water in the way modern dragonflies do, how it mated, how long it lived, all of this is essentially unknown. Behavior almost never fossilizes. The inner life of the Carboniferous sky is and may always remain beyond our reach. And then there is the question of what we have not yet found. The Carboniferous fossil record of insects is rich by geological standards, but sparse by biological ones. The conditions required to preserve insect fossils are specific and relatively rare. The coal measure deposits that have yielded most of the known specimens represent particular environments: swampy, low-energy depositional settings near the ancient equator. Insects that lived in drier environments, at higher altitudes, in more upland settings, are almost entirely absent from the record. How large did the giants truly get? The largest known Meganeuropsis specimen has a wingspan of 69 centimeters. But is that the largest individual that ever lived, or simply the largest that happened to die in a preservable location and survived to be excavated? The true upper limit of Carboniferous insect size may be larger than anything currently in any museum collection. The next great specimen might be buried in a coal seam that has not yet been opened. Waiting, as fossil specimens always wait, for the right person with the right tools to find it at the right moment. That possibility is not as remote as it might seem.
In 2022, a remarkably complete specimen of a giant Carboniferous insect, not a griffinfly, but a large Paleodictyopteran, a group of giant plant-feeding insects with wingspans exceeding 50 centimeters, was described from a new locality in France, demonstrating that new specimens of exceptional quality are still being recovered from Carboniferous deposits. The record is not closed. So where does all of this leave us? Standing, I think, at the edge of a very old world and a very young understanding. We know enough to reconstruct the broad outlines of what the Carboniferous was: the oxygen, the forests, the giants, the collapse. We know enough to say with confidence that the conditions that produced those giants cannot return, and why. We know enough to trace the lineage of every insect alive today back through the filter of the end Permian extinction to the small, adaptable survivors who rebuilt the insect world from almost nothing. But we do not know everything. We do not know the full size of the giants. We do not know the complete physiology of their breathing and their flight. We do not know, with precision, exactly how fast the oxygen fell, or exactly which combination of atmospheric change and ecological pressure delivered the final evolutionary pressure against large size. We do not know what it sounded like when Meganeuropsis flew. Some of these questions will be answered by future research. Better imaging technology, new fossil discoveries, more refined geochemical models, experimental work with living insects in controlled atmospheric conditions — all of these are active areas of investigation that will continue to sharpen our picture of the Carboniferous world. Some questions will remain open, permanently. Not because we lack the will to answer them, but because the evidence was destroyed by time, by heat, by pressure, by the indifferent machinery of geology that transforms the specific and fragile into the general and durable. The wing impression in the shale tells us a great deal. It does not tell us everything, and perhaps that is appropriate. Perhaps the Carboniferous giants deserve to retain some mystery. They existed in a world so different from our own that complete understanding may be, in a deep sense, beyond us. Not because our tools are inadequate, but because the gulf of time and circumstance between their world and ours is simply too vast for full imaginative reconstruction. We can know the facts. We cannot truly know the world. What we can do, what paleontology and geology and evolutionary biology allow us to do, is stand at the edge of that gulf and look across it with honest, careful, wondering eyes. To see the wing impression in the stone and understand, with appropriate humility, what it represents. Not just an extinct insect, not just a data point in a graph of oxygen versus body size. A life, a real, functioning, flying, hunting, breathing life, lived completely and with full biological intensity in a world that no longer exists, on a planet that has been through so many transformations since then that the Carboniferous feels less like history and more like mythology. Except that it is not mythology. It is coal under our feet. It is amber in a museum drawer. It is a wing, pressed in stone, spanning nearly 3/4 of a meter, waiting in the dark for someone to find it. The giants were here. The evidence is undeniable. And the world that made them,
that extraordinary oxygen-drunk, fungus-poor, predator-free, coal-making, ancient and alien world, is as real as the ground you are standing on right now. Because in a very literal sense, it is the ground you are standing on. The Carboniferous is beneath us. It never fully went away. It just became something else, as everything eventually does.
If this story left you with questions about the oxygen models, about specific species, about what other Carboniferous giants we have not covered today, about the end Permian extinction, or the first birds, or the biochemistry of lignin decomposition, leave them in the comments. These are exactly the kinds of questions that deserve longer answers, and the best ones will shape future videos. The deep past is not finished with us yet, and we are not finished with it. And the best ones will shape future videos. The deep past is not finished with us yet, and we are not finished with it.